Okay, so time for part two. All right, so as I was taking my break, I realized that I had left out a couple things in some of the discussion from part one. So we're going to cover that really quickly now and then move on to the other, well, to part two. So this is the beginning of part two. That should have been on part one, but here it is. Okay, folks, so we talked about in part one, our focus was on the Black Death, right? But not just on the disease itself, but on the repercussions of the Black Death. The Black Death can be considered one of those defining moments in history, one of those watershed moments in history, where uh, the people that were alive and doing their thing before and during it, and then the ones that made it afterwards, their lives were forever changed. And there's not many times in history where you can say that one event um, doesn't just affect a region or a kingdom or whatever, but this affected millions of people, millions upon millions of people, even the people that didn't die, that survived, that were whatever far enough away in some woodsy area or something like that, or on top of a mountain that it didn't reach them. Their lives were forever transformed. The effect was severe in that 4 years that it took for the Black Death to reach Europe and spread out from the south to the north, right? Because we remember it lands in earnest in Sicily, and from there it spreads north. And so for those 4 years between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death has, like I said, a transformative effect on European civilization, on European society, because everybody's affected, right? There's no way to escape from it. Basically, you don't know how it's being passed. You just know that if you get it, chances are you're probably a goner. Unfortunately, it affects old and young, the weak and the strong, man, women, Muslims, Jews, Christians. It doesn't matter. It affects you, and if you get it, well, that's it. But the people that come out the end of it, in 1351, that once it starts to dissipate and go, it's the effects are still, or excuse me, it still kind of peters around for a little bit. It's not like just one day all of a sudden a disease stops, but it gradually goes away, and the people that survive have developed the immunities to it, or they have not, they've not succumbed to it. But this is a defining moment, like I said, in European history and in world history, because the population loss is extensive and extreme, but as we've been talking about, and we're going to keep talking about today, the effects of the Black Death are profound, and they hit every aspect, every level of society in Europe. So now remember, in Europe, we have, remember, the people at the top, the nobles, the vast majority of people are at the bottom, the peasantry, but then we have that newer class that's slowly starting to gain more people. That's still very small, but we have that newer class, right? Or the middle class, the bourgeoisie, okay? But it doesn't matter. The Black Death is affecting all of them. And so, as we said, things were looking okay by the time we get to the 1300s. But then all of these things happen. All of these very deadly things happen. But going back to the consequences of the Black Death, there's two other things that we did not talk about, and they are focused on religion, but religion in the context of society as well, not just a strictly religious matter, but religion in the context of, how does this pertain to everybody, okay? Not just, people focused on the church, okay? Number one of those things is that the Black Death, remember, we talked about in part one how the Black Death ends up forcing a lot of people to start doing a little bit of second guessing about the church's response, and the lack of answers that they're getting. Why is this happening? Why did this village die? And the rote response to that usually is, well, it's God's will. Deus vult. It's God's will. Most people just take that at face value. Okay, well, man, it's God's will. It sucks, but it is what it is. Others start to think differently a little bit. We talked about how there's always been heretics. People that went against the teachings of the church. But the Black Death starts this process where more people, certainly not the majority, but more people start to second guess the church in several different ways. Basically saying, you don't have the answers. We're asking you, why is this happening? The answers you're giving are either not working, or they're no answer. And so it's showing to us that you really don't know everything, that the church is not infallible, that you don't have the ear of God, that and how much else. So this starts to wear on people's minds. How much else are you fabricating, or how much else are you saying is this when it's really that? Okay. And so people are starting to challenge that. But on the opposite side of the coin, right, is you have, and this happens in any type of thing that's going on, even like right now, is you have not a restricting or pulling away from religion, but you have a constriction and an expansion of certain people towards religion, okay? And that happened in the Black Death, during it, while it was going on, and afterwards as well. You have a rise in what's called zealotry, 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 okay? And zealots were an actual group of people. They were Jewish, and they were fighters. They were like resistance fighters, and they were actually called the Zealots. And we talked a little tiny bit about them when the Romans destroyed the temple, and when the Romans took Jerusalem. The Zealots were right there on the line, the front line, fighting against them. And so we get so that word has come down in our lexicon, in the modern lexicon, as being a person who is almost hyper obsessed with whatever they believe in, right? That they're a zealot, that they are willing to do anything in defense of their cause, whatever they believe in. So it doesn't even have to be religious in the modern sense of the term. It could be anything, like they're a zealot for, good manners or something like that. In the Middle Ages, with zealotry, you see groups of people. It's not like there's millions of them, but they were around all throughout Europe, that they got closer to the church, as opposed to pulling away. They got closer to the church, but they were thinking about this God's punishment in terms of their own, to the point where even the church was starting to say, you're getting kind of out of control, you're getting kind of out of hand. That's not really what the public, the PR image that we want portrayed. But they were doing it anyway because they were zealots. And that's the thing about a zealot or a fanatic, is that they oftentimes cannot be reasoned with. They're going to do what they're going to do, and the way they believe is how they believe, and you're not going to change their mind. So we see that with the Black Death. The biggest group of zealots during this time were a group of radical Christians called the Flagellates, okay? Flagellates, or flagellates. Not flatulence, but the flagellates, okay? Here's an example of them. What are they doing here? Well, flagellates they could be anybody. They could actually be they could be a priest, but oftentimes they were just regular people that had devoted themselves to punishing themselves, and in their mind, they believed that this was God's punishment, and that man was inherently sinful, and that man had grown so sinful that this was God's reckoning, that God was going to wipe everybody off the planet and basically start over, that that God had given us life and God had given us free will, but that we had messed it up. We had screwed up with all of the bad things that we do. And so the flagellates, the term comes from flagellum, which means whip, what they did was, it was in their way of thinking, it was a devotion to Christ, since Christ was as part of his passion. He was purged, he was whipped he was scourged, which means that he was whipped by the Roman authorities, but not just whipped with like strands of rawhide or leather, but there was actually bits and chunks that were wrapped into the leather, and so he was scourged, which is terrible. Whipping is terrible enough. You whip somebody hard enough, you're gonna slice that skin open. You're gonna get the bone. If a person gets whipped hard enough or too many times, they're gonna die. It can be a form of capital punishment. Usually, it's just a form of punishment. You only give somebody a couple whips or a couple lashes. But with scourging, it means that you're literally digging pieces out of them. With each time you're hitting them. Well, the flagellates were doing the same thing. So there'd be a group of them. They'd roll into a village or a town. They're usually very simply dressed, only wearing maybe like a loincloth or some kind of a pair of trousers, usually topless. We're going shirtless, and they have one or two whips. And what are they doing? It's called self-flagellation. Somebody is not sitting there, tying them to a post and whipping them. They're holding their own whips and they're whipping themselves. They're going back and forth, across each shoulder and whipping themselves across. Okay. Well, you can do that a couple times, and then your back's going to start getting red. But you start doing it all day, pretty soon the blood's going to start flowing. And so, what these flagellates would do, they would go into a village, whatever, and they'd be praying and they'd be doing their chants. And basically, in their mind, the idea was that if they punished themselves enough, God would, see that they're giving their penance, that they're giving their, he would give them absolution, basically saying, look, I see what you're doing and I appreciate it. And I understand, that you're giving me this, your pain, your suffering. And so I will, get rid of this disease. I will move the plague on and not have you deal with it anymore. This becomes a problem between civil versus church authorities, because if you're a civil authority, right? If you're like the Lord Mayor of a town and things are already falling apart, the last thing you need are these zealots coming in there and causing mass confusion and panic and everything else. But that's unfortunately what we see in an event where we're seeing mass hysteria. If we have something that's going on where maybe a small but vocal minority are going nuts and telling everybody this is the way it is, the people start getting a little bit weird and they start getting freaked out. So civil authorities oftentimes would bar the gates, keep these people out. I don't want them in. Now this ran in conflict with the church, because officially these people, they're not members of the church. Well, they could be, as in they're Christians, but it's not like the church is sanctioning them. Okay. And also, in regards to that too, many church authorities were joining with the civil authorities, basically saying, look, we don't want you here doing this thing, okay? Because not only is it, are they right, it's causing a bunch of panic, but it's almost like we can't control you, because it's not like the church authorities could come up to a zealot and say, hey, stop doing that. And the zealot says, okay, yeah, sure, I won't. And so it would be showing the people that the church does not have control over certain sections of itself, okay? And so it didn't want that. So oftentimes the civil and church authorities were on the same team here, keeping these people away, okay? And then moving on, number two, unfortunately, one of the terrible things that happened with the Black Death, as if it wasn't bad enough, is we see a sharp uptick in anti-Semitism, okay? We've talked about this, how the life of a Jewish person in the Middle Ages, it was like walking on eggshells all the time, right? We've seen that in the cities. They were always forced to their own little section of town. They could mingle, but then they had to go back. They had to be clearly identified, often by law, with certain emblems on their shirts, on their clothes. There was laws prohibiting like marriage between a Jewish person and a Christian person, things like that. We also saw with the Crusades, so 300 years earlier, that on their way to the Holy Land, that Jewish populations were terrorized and victimized and and murdered in a very, very sad state. Because remember, once again, right before the Crusades, you get the People's Crusade. Remember, I told you about that. The guy Peter the Hermit. He was a zealot. He was a fanatic, and he got all these other fanatics to go along with him. And it's easy for a fanatic to point at his loyal group of followers and put the blame on these people over here and say they're the ones doing it, and get them to do whatever you want to this other group of people. So the same thing was happening. These people were freaking out, with the Black Death. They didn't, why is it starting? What can I do to do it? And anti-Semitism really goes up during this time. And so if you're a Jewish person, you learn to do what you need to do and then hide, basically. But you're having to deal with the Black Death as well, too. You're not safe from it just because you're Jewish. But you learn to hide and keep a very, very low profile, because any moment, especially in a city, where these usually these Jewish populations are, as opposed to out to the countryside, you know that these fanatics or just regular people that have had enough, or are letting this hysteria get to them, could come, and oftentimes it led to extreme violence, including burning of Jewish people, putting them to the stakes. What they would do is, since they didn't know how the contagion spread, rumors and innuendo floated around towns, and there was always this persistent urban myth that whenever something happened, there's some kind of disease, even before the Black Death, it was because the Jews had this grand conspiracy and they were poisoning the well, poisoning the well, and that's where that term comes from. They were poisoning the wells. They would, according to these civil authorities and just regular people, that the Jewish people were intentionally, putting poison or whatever, doing something in the well, and it would cause all this contagion and death and violence. And then they would grab these people and be like, "Why'd you do it?" Poor guy's like, "I don't know what you're talking about." Torture, torture, torture. Imagine that. He's confessing to everything because he's in a lot of pain. And so we see the rise of anti-Semitism all throughout Europe. Especially where there are large Jewish populations, okay? But so, both of these are religious in aspect, but now we see how that religion and civil authority is starting to blur a lot. And you're getting this was starting to separate. But during this panic, this Black Death that was going on, they start to blur again, okay? And they're going to have to separate once more later on, okay? All right, and then also, let's get back to, okay. So we finished off in part one. We talked about how in the 1500s, so we jumped ahead a little bit, or excuse me, the 1400s, jumped ahead a little bit. The grand city of Constantinople, the great city that was Constantine's capital in the east, that had been around since the 300s. By the year 1453, the whole Eastern Roman Empire was a shadow of itself. We saw the beginnings of that with the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and how the Christians did not do themselves a favor when they defeated another Christian city, thereby helping out the Muslim armies that would slowly spread into Europe proper. But by 1453, the Eastern Roman Empire is basically just the city. And it's inevitable that it was going to collapse. And it does. In May of 1453, it finally collapses, and it is taken over by, remember, Sultan Mehmed II. But what was he using that was so important? Now, did this thing turn the tide of battle? Yes and no. Yes, in that this thing, gunpowder, helped smash those city walls, like we've seen, right? Where army after army in ancient times and medieval times had thrown themselves against these walls and been totally destroyed. And so gunpowder allowed for huge amounts of damage to occur every day. Far more than the defenders could fix, and then it was only a matter of time. However, we also see that that gunpowder is in its infancy, okay, in the 1400s. That Mehmet had these cannons brought in. They are not rifled, they're just smooth bore. So you stick a big cannon, basically, even a cannonball itself is not like it's perfectly rounded ball because it's not like it's being produced at a factory. They were called gunstones because in the beginning, they used to just basically chisel down a stone or a large rock, and not make it as smooth as they could, but it still had imperfections. And they would shove it down in there and pack in some gunpowder beneath it and light it. Well, it kind of is bouncing around as it's shooting out. It's not very accurate, but what does it do? It causes a big noise. And if you've never seen that before, it's terrifying. Causes huge amount of smoke, and it causes terror in the enemy ranks if you're not used to it. But if it does actually have a direct hit, the damage that it unleashes is unbelievable compared to just a guy standing there with a sword or even a knight on a horse. And gunpowder at this time is pretty inconsequential. However, we need to talk about this. Gunpowder and the use of firearms in Europe had been in effect for about 200 years before the fall of Constantinople in 1453. But like I said, they were very, very rudimentary and very, very basic. So they really didn't turn the tide of any battles or anything like that. It was just basically for show. Like, hey, look at this new toy that I have. But it's a toy that doesn't go away. It's a toy that keeps getting modified, and they work out the kinks, and they make it better, and they make it better, and they make it better. Okay, let me show you a picture. Okay. Once again, remember, so gunpowder originates in China, and they were using it basically for like fireworks and theatrical displays. But eventually somebody got the bright idea that, hey, I can make this round tube made out of metal. I can stick this stuff inside of it. I can put these round things inside of it, and I can use it to, blast out a projectile. Oh, hey, how's it going? All right. Hey, how's it going? Hey, yeah, I see you. Okay, go away. Thank you. Okay. And that had made it to Europe by the 13th century, okay, so by the 1200s. But this toy doesn't go away. In fact, it just keeps getting better and better and better, because if there's one thing that humans do really well, it's finding the things that cause the most destruction and tinkering with them and working on them harder and harder and harder. Say, hey, you know what? This destroyed so well before, or this didn't destroy things so well before, but now I've made it better. Now I can destroy even more things. So we're very, very good at that, and that's what happens. The advancement of gunpowder in Europe is a game changer, folks. So just like the Black Death is a watershed moment, when gunpowder starts hitting the battlefield in large amounts, with these different weapons that they're using, this is once again a watershed moment. Everything before this time is one way, and everything after is due to this major transformative world event. Okay, gunpowder will forever change the way that Europeans deal with one another. Armies will get bigger. Armies will become more powerful, far more powerful than anything that even the Crusaders or the Roman legions or anything like that, could even begin to hope for. Because gunpowder can cause so much destruction. And remember, it's using new technology rather than just brute strength, okay? Because you can have like a centurion in the Roman times that's 6'3", and he's huge, but he's only as good as how he works with the group, right? Because if he's out there fighting, he might kill 20 barbarians, but eventually he's going to be overwhelmed. But gunpowder is the great equalizer. Okay, all you have to do is get somebody with even a fraction of a brain, show them how this apparatus works, and now all of a sudden you have a person that can affect the conclusion, whether it's victory or defeat in a battle. Okay, So, and here we have that. This is a perfect representation of it. This is a drawing from the late 15th century, so 1400s. And here we see the perfect melding of the old technologies with the newer technologies and then the newest technologies, okay? So the old technologies is obviously the city walls and the castle defending. You have people wearing armor, here they are, the vast majority of people wearing armor. You still have the old ways of fighting, right? Stick a ladder up there, hopefully you don't get a rock on the head or an arrow in the eye. You've got guys using arrows, bows and arrows, but then you have that new thing that we saw with crossbows, so that's new technology, very powerful. But then what do you see? Not just guys wearing swords, but you see guys, like look at this guy. He's loading his gun. He's loading his rifle here. And more importantly, and then look up here, you still got guys, holding bow and arrow, right? So the old world and the new world, and right behind him, what do you got? This guy is sitting there, getting this cannon ready. He's going to use this to blow a hole in that wall. This is going to be far more effective. It's a slower process. This is going to be far more effective than just unleashing 20,000 guys against the city walls and losing 10,000 of them. Now all of a sudden you can have machines do the work for you to obliterate that wall so you can get guys in there without having to send them over the top of the wall, okay? There is a small amount of time in the grand scheme of things, about 100 to 150 years, where the old world, represented by the feudalism, right? All the stuff we talked about, fealty, homage, pledging your devotion to a king, all of that, and most importantly, the knight, where that old world shares a battlefield with this new world, with the gun, okay? There's about a period about 100, 150 years, between 1350 to maybe coming up to like 1500, okay? Where the old world, embodied by the literal knight, okay? The literal knight that has been there for hundreds of years now. The knight was the pinnacle of the armed forces in the Middle Ages, okay? It was the knight, a fully armored knight, trained knight, was the embodiment of the warrior. It was the secret weapon. The more you had, the stronger your army was. But once we get to the age of gunpowder, where even the most rudimentary firearm can blast these knights out of the saddle. So here you got a guy who's been training his whole life with the sword and the shield, how to control his horse, how to maneuver on the battlefield. And then you've got some bumpkin here that has been, they've stuck a rifle in his hand, and they've pointed at that guy, and boom, and that's it. But as the meaning of knighthood and this old world of feudalism starts going away, we see the rise of gunpowder and new technology, okay? They cannot coexist for long. Like I said, they coexist for about 100, 150 years, but that's about it. Until finally, the knighthood, being a knight, becomes completely and utterly symbolic. There's still knights fighting on the battlefields after the year 1500. There's still knights now, but you'd be hard pressed to compare like Sir Paul McCartney and Sir Elton John with Sir Lancelot. Okay, the knights learn that doing their old thing that they used to do, right, charge in there on battle with sword and spear, is a death sentence, and that gunpowder is the thing that's here, and it just keeps getting better and better for people developing that. Okay, all right, and the old way of these guns, the first guns really made were called these rifles called arquebusiers or arquebuses, and they were basically just a tube, right, with a butt, and you put the ball down there, and then you slit open a little notch right here, and that's where there was a little hole that went into the barrel, and you put some powder right there, and basically you had a wick, a long piece of rope, that just hung there, and it was slow burn, and you would just light it at the beginning of the battle, then you'd set it up on this little like stand, you'd aim, right? Has an effective range of between 50 and 70 yards. It has a full range about 300 yards. But it's not gonna hit, you're not gonna hit nothing, basically. And then you just put that thing to the gunpowder and it fires off, and there you go, then you move off. But eventually those guns will get more and more advanced with moving parts, okay? But once again, that really starts spelling the end of the medieval world. The end of, knights and armor and castles and all this, because they're pointless. You can build the biggest castle, and it might take 22 years to build this big giant castle with these big towers and thick walls. Have walls that are 8 feet thick. It's huge and it's very, very powerful. It's very imposing for a person who's standing there. But when you stick 8 cannons against it, it's not so imposing. You can bring it down pretty quickly. Okay. All right. So. The most lasting ramification, folks, of the fall of Constantinople is not only that the Eastern Empire, falls apart and is gone forever, and it's been gone forever for 600 years now, but that once again it's an example, it's a sign showing that the ancient world, the Romans, well, they're gone. They're long gone now. They've been around in like old manuscripts and things like that, but as an empire, as their thing, they're done. Okay. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Hold on one second. They've been around, as we've seen, with these scholars finding something that an old Roman wrote 800 years before. But once again, the fall of Constantinople is a direct physical symbol to all those in the West that the old world is at an end. The old world is done, and we're slowly moving on to this modern world, this modern society. Okay, the Romans are gone. What happens at the end of that is that the Muslim armies pour in, right? The Turkish armies pour into Constantinople, and all these people come flooding out. There are many people that just say, whatever, I will just stay here and I will convert to Islam and do my thing. But there are many others that don't. And remember, we talked about that the cultural heritage of the Eastern Empire for over a millennium now at this point is Greek. Okay, so what do these people do? They leave, and where are they going to go? They go to the West. They head to the West. So here we have a beautiful representation of that. This is called the School of Athens, and it was done by the Renaissance painter Raphael. And here we see his representation of all these great learners, right? This is not a true-to-life portrait, but it's basically he stuck all these great learners like Plato and Aristotle, all these people that didn't live at the same time, and he put them all together. And so this is his representation of showing that this is what happens. All these learners and scholars and all this knowledge in Constantinople, all these people that have this knowledge, they flee, they take off, and they go to the West, and oftentimes they settle in Rome. Okay. The other ancient capital. They settle in Rome. Well, what do they bring with them? They bring those things, okay? They're literally fleeing with the, shirts on their backs. They bring all that ancient knowledge, okay? So we've seen that in dribs and drabs, especially like the Crusades and the mixture, once again, of East and West, how people from the West are bringing new ideas back and new, concepts. But this really opens up the dam for this. Now, all of a sudden, people in the West, in Europe, are now encountered with all this new information that isn't new. It's ancient information, but it's new to them. Even if you studied Greek or you were a scholar in the West, it's new. You're getting they're bringing with them all these ancient ideas and that will lead to new concepts that we'll talk about with the Renaissance here. Okay, but very, very, very important. Okay. A flood of the old/new information coming to the West, okay? One of the consequences of the Black Death, but much about 100 years later is that as the Europeans, get back on their feet, because that's what people do. People get kicked in the mouth, and some people don't survive. But then the rest that do survive, they just, pick themselves up and they dust themselves off and they start all over again. Okay, and that's what they do. So these Europeans start doing that. And what do they immediately go back to? And that is trade, right? Trade, because remember, trade is now the lifeblood of Europe. All across Europe, not just the South, not just the Mediterranean, but all across Europe, everybody's eager for trade. Again, because that was what was making them powerful. That was what was making them get the things that they now desired, right? Is to trade. It didn't matter now that you didn't worship the same God. All that mattered was that you had something that I wanted, and I have something that you want. And so they go back to trade. By the time we get to the 15th century, folks, the 1400s, we're seeing new technology in trading. The Europeans have, for the most part, always consigned themselves to the Mediterranean Sea. This was the largest expanse of, unless you're a Viking, but the majority of Europeans, this is the largest expanse of water that you dare tackle. It's scary enough. It's a huge body of water. But we've seen the Greeks, the Romans, everybody else, what did they do? They had ships, but their ships were notoriously small and not built for long sea voyages. Going out into the Atlantic Ocean, you can only go out so far, and if you kept going out further, well, it was a death sentence. You're basically condemning your ship to never being seen again. The ships could not take the storms on the ocean, and the technology was not there. Not only that, so even if you did last out there for a couple weeks, the technology was not there for you to get back. Okay, the technology was not there yet for you to get back, and so new technology had to be developed. And it was developed in a part of Europe that, we oftentimes don't really think about. We're talking about England and France and everything else, but they're not the ones that did this. The first people that did this are the Portuguese, okay? Portuguese, who carved out their own little kingdom there on the Iberian Peninsula, while the Spanish were doing the same thing with their kingdoms. The Portuguese. Oops. Damn it. Okay. The Portuguese realize that, here they are, little Portugal right up here. Portugal is not it's not a big, and during this time, it's not some big, military power like England or France or even Spain next door. But they realize that you don't have to be big and powerful militaristically in order to be big and powerful. As we talked about with Genoa and Venice, which were two city-states, small city-states, they had gained their power and notoriety and money through trading. And so the Portuguese did the same. The Portuguese, though, are obviously not on the Mediterranean, and so they looked further southward and outward. They realized they couldn't go further west because it was just Atlantic Ocean. They didn't know it was on the other side yet. The old wives' tale of, by this point, you all know, and they all knew as well, that the earth was round. But still, knowing the earth was round and not knowing if you're ever going to come back are two different things. So they weren't going to go west, but they knew what was south of them, which is Africa. And they knew that if you kept going further south, there was still more land. So the first ships that they built were built to still hug the coast, but be out on the ocean, because obviously you're out on the Atlantic Ocean. And that's what they did in the mid to late 1400s. They have developed new ships, okay? And the new ship that they developed, I got a picture of it here, is this. It's called the caravel. There's some confusion about where the word caravel actually comes from. They've traced it to, they believe, like linguists have etymologists have traced it to like a bastardization of a Arabic word for like post or something like that, if I can remember. But it doesn't matter. The thing that does matter is that this ship, and you might recognize this because it is the same type of ship that Christopher Columbus sails in when he does sail across the Atlantic Ocean. So this thing can tackle the open ocean, and the Portuguese proved this many years before Christopher Columbus gets his bright idea to go do his thing. It looks big, but it's really not. If I showed you this out, if we're standing there at another ship looking at it, or even if we're on land looking at it, it's about the size of or about the length of 2 school buses, okay? So it's actually very short. It can hold a complement comfortably between 40 to 50 men, okay? So it's not like you can stick 6,000 men on there like some aircraft carriers, something like that. This is not built for war. You can build these for war, and what is going to get stuck on them? Remember, cannons and everything else. But this is built for 2 things. It's built for sailing, okay, getting someplace safe, getting the men there safe, and trade, okay? So she's got a big rear end back here, and she's got a big berth. So what that means is when they make it to point B, they came from point A and they make it to point B, what are they going to fill it up with? They're going to fill it up with a ton of trading goods. They're going to fill it up with a whole bunch of stuff that you can now bring back and sell at the markets and everything else and become fabulously wealthy, okay? So if we take a look at the map, we see the same thing. At first, they just hugged the coast and they set up forts and everything else up and down Africa, the west coast of Africa, but eventually they start swinging further out. They make it all the way to the Cape of Good Hope, which is a very terrible storm-ridden place in South Africa. And where do they eventually make it to? The prize possession, the #1 place that all these Europeans wanted to go. Because remember, they knew about the East. They knew all these amazing things are over there. They finally make it there to both the subcontinent of India and also to China, okay, and to the Spice Islands here. This is it, guys. This is the bullseye. This is what they're looking for. Why? Because it has all the stuff. Because it's literally on the other side of the planet. It has all the stuff that you can't get in Europe, right? It has silk, and it has all these spices, and it's got gold. It's got all this stuff that you either have run out of in Europe, or you just can't get it at all. Now, how long does this take? If you hop on one of these suckers, right, you hop on one of these. This is a miserable voyage. You're not sitting there in first class, okay? It's a miserable voyage. You're working hard. You're going. If you go in Portugal, and if somehow you make it to the other side of the planet, for instance, like India or even China, that's about a year voyage, okay? You're going to stay there for a while, and then you're going to pack up your stuff, and then you're going to come back. So the wife and kids may not see you for between 3 to 5 years. It could be as long as that. And that's not even saying when you run into pirates or just the good old-fashioned storm, and then you're at the end, you're at the bottom of the ocean, okay? But if you do make it back, what has happened? Well, you've managed to bring back stuff that nobody can get, and people are willing to pay top price for it, okay? Because it is something that they can't get, okay? It is you have brought them something that they absolutely want, okay? So we see new technology with sailing as well. We also see new technology with map making. As these Europeans start going out and exploring new places, we start seeing their maps get a lot better. So this is a representation of an old Greek map. We've seen this before. And then there's Greece, right? And we can kind of make out where things are. There was 2 reasons why ancient maps were, well, pretty useless. Number 1 reason, obviously, and they couldn't help it, is because they didn't know what was around the corner. They only knew what they knew from like traders or other merchants or whatever it might be. And so they had to go, if you were a map maker living in ancient Greece, you had to go by word of mouth. You weren't there. You hadn't gone all the way over here. You were told what it looks like, and you were told what these sailors had seen, whatever it might be, okay? So you built it. So that's number 1 reason why it's not so great. Number 2 is that all of these ancient maps were focused geographically on a power relationship, okay? A power relationship. When you're making a map, where are you going to stick home? You're going to stick it basically in the middle, basically telling everybody that's looking at the map, we're center stage, we're right here. You're not going to stick wherever you are out there in the middle of nowhere off by itself. There's a a relationship to where you are. So for instance, you know, like you go to a party, you know, that person who has, you know, whatever, all the girlfriends, or he's, you know, he's the person that people want to gravitate to. Is he hiding along the wall? No, he's in the center of the room. He's the person to gravitate towards. He's not the wallflower hanging out over here by themselves. Same thing. If you're the one building a map, you're going to stick your civilization basically in the middle. Like, here we are. And as we learn about the Greeks, what do the Greeks think? Well, we're the best. Everybody else is barbarians. They're no good. But it means that the map is basically useless, because everything that you don't know, that is out there, you just fill in the blank. I think there might be a river here, and I think there, you know, whatever. It's only as limited as your imagination, okay? But maps are getting much better. So here we have a map that was done in the 15th century, okay? In the 14th century, so 1300s. We're seeing that it's starting to fill out a little bit, aren't we? We're starting to definitively see specific places, okay? The geography is and the exact representation are still pretty way off, but we get an idea. Here's Italy, right, horizontal. Here we have the Iberian Peninsula, Africa, Greece, and the Holy Land, and then, you know, Arabia, and then out here it's just this big hodgepodge. Now, what's really cool about this is this person has made this map not only representing land masses, but also topographical features too. He's put in different mountain ranges and everything else. Now, most of this is basically him just making stuff up, or, you know, what he has learned from sailors or whatever it might be. So, is it good? Yeah, I guess. But if you're an actual sailor out there, you can't look at the map and be like, oh, that shouldn't be there. It doesn't show that on the map, okay? But it starts getting better until we get to the 16th century, into like the early 1500s, and what do we notice on here for the first time? We notice, well, now there's whole new land masses out here, because now the New World has been discovered, okay? And so once again, we see another nail getting driven in that coffin of that old world mentality, that old world thinking. This is a pretty good representation of the world at the time. You've got Africa, we've got Europe, right? Italy, Spain, we've got England up there, Arabia, right? Greece, and you're starting to even get a little bit more understanding of the Far East as well, okay? Like India and the islands and stuff like that there. Still not great, still not great. The map makers, or the cartographers, are still putting in a lot of nonsense because they just don't know. But this one's really cool because it definitively shows, you know, the Earth is round. So if there's any flat earthers watching this, please drop out now and go do something else with your lives, okay? And we have, right, the old world on the left, and then we have the new world on the right. Pretty amazing, okay? So that starts to really go out there. Saw that. Oh, here's another one, right? So here we have the medieval siege. They're fighting, doing the old stuff, but then there's the new stuff. There it is, okay? And there you go. Okay. Now moving on. Now those Portuguese, they use that, their trading connections, to be kind of the top dog for, well, a long time. For about 100 years there, the Portuguese are kicking butt. For such a small, you know, little kingdom there, they're making it to places that nobody else has really made it to. Eventually, those other countries catch up too. England, France, Spain especially. But the Portuguese, for a small amount of time, have a pretty good monopoly going when it comes to trade with the East. And some of those first colonies that are in India and those places definitely have a Portuguese flair to them. They built on, you know, Portuguese, a mixture of the Portuguese culture that showed up, along with the local cultures that were already there, obviously. Okay, and there you go. All right, folks. So we're starting to get to the end of this course. Okay. Now, as much as I would love to do this, when we start talking about the Renaissance, this is not going to be anything specific, really, okay? We're not going to be talking about art history, or you know, I don't know what else. I'm trying to think of when I was when I was learning about the Renaissance and Western traditions. They don't even call it that anymore. Years and years ago. I'm going to give you a basic overview of the importance of the Renaissance rather than just diving into, like, here, let's study this painting from Leonardo. I'm going to show you stuff like that, but we're going to be talking about the overview of the Renaissance, okay? What the Renaissance meant, when did it start, when did it end, how was the Renaissance the dagger in the heart of the old world, and how did these new things that were coming to pass really flourish in the Renaissance, okay? So that's what we're going to be focusing on when we talk about that today, in part 2, and then also next week when we do our last one, okay? But the Renaissance is a French word, and it loosely translates to rebirth, okay? Renaissance, or American Renaissance, okay? Rebirth. Now, what is this a rebirth of? It's a rebirth, because many people get this confused. They say, well, the Renaissance was all of a sudden, there's a bunch of old stuff doing old people doing old things, and all of a sudden, Europe becomes this, hugely progressive thing, and they're doing all this amazing stuff that they never had done before. Well, that last part is true. They were doing a bunch of amazing stuff that they hadn't really done before, but it wasn't just, okay, everybody woke up one day and said, okay, stop doing the old ways, and now we're gonna start doing the new ways. That's not how humanity works. That's not what happens. The Renaissance is a mixture, and it couldn't have happened if, these other things had not occurred. So for instance, history is oftentimes like a set of dominoes. You could drop one domino over here, but if it's by itself, well, who cares? Would it have mattered to all the other dominoes? Who knows? We'll never know. But when you drop one domino against another one, it starts the chain reaction. I know this is a lame analogy, but it works. When you drop one domino with the other one, start the chain reaction, it pushes us onward to the modern era, to the modern age, how we have developed now to the point in April whatever in 2020. But the Renaissance is a melding, a mixture of the old world and the new world, okay? We have to wait a couple centuries until we get to the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution before we can truly start chopping away the old vestiges of the old world and say, this is inherently new, this is incredibly new, nobody's ever thought about this, the Romans didn't think about this, the Greeks didn't think about this, nothing like that, okay? But the Renaissance is a mixture of all that stuff, and we're getting a little tiny bit of it all throughout the Middle Ages, even in those dark ages, right? Where those scholars, those few people that were literate, were still transcribing, right, and rewriting and learning the knowledge of the ancient people, the Greeks and the Romans. But for a large part, it was useless. It was pointless information. It was trivia information. It was Jeopardy questions to the majority of people. Majority of people were just trying to live. The majority of people were just trying to, go day by day. What food am I going to have today? Am I going to survive today? Is some, warlord going to come through and terrorize my family and my village? That's what they were thinking of. They weren't thinking about Aristotle and Ovid and Socrates. No, they weren't thinking about that. But by the time we get to the Renaissance, so now we're talking about, and that's the other thing. When does it start? When can we definitively say, hey, this is when the Renaissance starts, flip the calendar over. I gave you those time periods, and those time periods are loosely based. And when we first started talking about, the Middle Ages, many people declare that once the Black Death is over, basically, in 1351, that is when the Renaissance starts. Other people put it as late as well into the 1400s. But when does it end? That's the other question. When does it end? And my answer to those is that it really doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference to be chronologically accurate. Who cares if it started in 1352, or if it started in 1400, or if it started in 1430? Who cares? Some people say as late as 1453, with the fall of Constantinople. As humans, we like to bookend things, this and this, and then this, what happened in the middle, that's what we need to look at. But who cares? Once again, when it specifically started or when it specifically ended. The point is, and the thing that we need to focus on, that we're going to focus on for this last part of part two, is that it did happen, and it was once again a transformative thing that happened in European society. Okay, it was once again the stuff that was created, the stuff that was thought of, the stuff that was done during this time period, however long it was, radically changed European society, and in essence changed world history. Not just European history, European society, but changed world history from then on out. Okay, so just like you have the fall of the Roman Empire, 1,000 years before, you have the Renaissance that starts. Okay, the rebirth of the classics, of this mixture of the old knowledge with the new knowledge. Okay, where does it begin? Well, you guys know this story. It begins in earnest in northern Italy. Okay, in northern Italy. There is a major reason why that happens. Well, because remember, in these other kingdoms, like in England and France, well, not only are they sitting there fighting each other and killing each other for 100 years, when you have the ideas that are coming around here, you need huge amounts of freedom, okay? That old fight, once again, between, civic duty, what do I do for my fellow man, versus personal freedom. You need large amounts of freedom to think, freedom to do, freedom to act, okay? In a kingdom or underneath a monarchy, in a feudalistic system, you are very limited. You are very limited, okay? What you can think and what you can do are only goes so far as what the king or the lords or whatever says you can do, okay? They are still in charge. You can only do as much as what the law allows or what your local lord allows. During the Renaissance, remember, we've seen what has developed here. Are they, the Kingdom of Venice or something? No, it's these city-states, okay? And in the 1400s, there's no other political entities in Europe that are as free and open as these northern Italian city-states, okay? It's not to say that, it's like you can compare it to the modern times, not at all. But in relation to the kingdoms surrounding them, the ability to go there and do things that would be unheard of even, 30 years before, it happens. So just like now in a modern society, you might come from a very conservative place, where like they've always done something that same way. And when anybody tried to, change that up, they were, shunned or, like, no, you can't do it. Or they were punished, maybe even like, you'll go away. We don't want that type of stuff here. We do things a certain way here. So oftentimes people go to like an urban area, right? They go to a city, because remember, we learned that, people were doing that even then, 700 years ago, that you go to be anonymous, but you go to find that identity. So where was this happening? In northern Italy, in these city-states, where these people, in relation to their times, had the most freedom available, okay, to them to get these things done. Many people often confuse the Renaissance as well too, with that it was a rejection of religion and a triumph of science. This is very inaccurate, okay? The Renaissance was not a rejection of religion. Quite the contrary. The Holy Roman Church at the time of the Renaissance was one of the largest instigators and benefactors when it came to the Renaissance. And you think to yourself, well, I don't understand. Why would they allow new ideas to flourish? Because wouldn't you want the new ideas to go away? Because you want the old ideas to be there, like the church is in charge. Yes and no. They realize, the church has done a lot of changing, and especially because they've been affected by the Black Death too, and they've realized that, they've shown some chinks in their armor, that they're not impervious to questioning at this point. They're still fighting it wherever they can, questioning of the church's authority, obviously, but they are, it depends on which pope is there as well too. There are many, progressive popes, and then there's many very conservative popes, and so it depends on which pope is ruling at the time. But for the large part, the Renaissance is not a rejection of religion. Almost all, if not all, of the representations in artwork, paintings, literature, architecture, whatever it might be, incorporates some kind of religiosity into it in the Renaissance, okay? These people that are coming up, these Renaissance men, these artisans and these masters, like Da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael and Caravaggio and all these guys that are coming up, they're not some atheists running around saying, religion sucks, I'm done with the Catholic Church. Not at all. For all of them, the Catholic Church is one of their biggest patrons. We're going to be talking about that word here in just a second. Is one of their biggest patrons, basically using these men's talents and abilities to create for the church. Now, we're going to be talking about another word, a very, very important word, humanism, next week when we wrap up this course. But right now, I just want you to focus on this, getting this out of your mind if this is how you think about it, because it is not. It's not a rejection of religion, but it is a triumph of science and religion, if that makes sense, okay? The Renaissance is taking, remember, all that old information and putting it into something new, a new understanding, a new idea, okay? And that's what this is about. The Renaissance is about old and new, but not just old and new, but what? Something different, something fresh, something unseen, or a reimagining of something that's been done before. How can it be shown now as opposed to how it was done, 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago with the Romans, whatever it might be, okay? Okay, so like I said, the Renaissance begins in northern Italy, and that is where it flourishes, okay? Northern Italy is the perfect seedbed for the ideas of the Renaissance, for this rebirth. Like I said, a ton of those people that fled, those scholars that fled from Constantinople, they're not going all the way like Paris. Obviously, they go to those places, but they are a whole centers of learning expand in these places, okay, in northern Italy, all right? So like Milan and Florence, especially. Florence is ground zero for the Renaissance. Ferrara, Verona, Modena, okay? You might recognize all of these terms if you've studied or all of these cities' names if you've studied your Shakespeare. But this is where it begins, folks. This is where it begins, okay? Because there's that freedom, there's that ability there. Now, it doesn't mean that there's complete freedom. You can't just run around in the middle of in Florence or Venice and say something bad about the church or something like that, okay? There's no First Amendment floating around. But freedom in relation to many of the places around Europe, especially like in France, things like that, absolutely. Very constrictive, very not constrictive, very restrictive, okay? So we see these great city-states, they rise and flourish, and they gain their power from trade, obviously, but now they gain their power by being the epicenter of learning, the epicenter of this new thing, this Renaissance that is happening, okay? Okay, and during this time, okay. Okay. It's during this time in the Italian city-states that we see what's called the rise of the great families, okay? The cream will always float to the top, And the same thing happens when it comes to politics and economy. So these great families don't just appear and all of a sudden say, we're the great family. It's taken them a long time, okay? It's taken them a long time to get to the top. But the conditions were right for these families to do something that was different, that was innovative. Most of them were based along financial lines. Most of them were banking families. And as we talked about with banking in the last discussion, banking becomes the lifeblood of Europe, like it will become the lifeblood throughout the world. Without banks, you can't get anything done. Banks become instrumental and fundamental to a rising kingdom, a rising city-state, and then in the modern terms, in a rising state, nation state. You need banks, unfortunately. It's just what happens. And these great families rise through the sheer power of being a banking family, okay? So what is going on in this portrait? This is so I'll give you a list of them. Oops, there we go. These are the Visconti family, okay? The Visconti family. It was tradition for the head of the family, the paterfamilias, and his wife, so the lord and lady of that family, to get a portrait where they're facing one another, okay? Now, why? Well, not that they're equals, okay, because she's still a woman and she's still underneath him, but to show that together and that as a family, they are powerful, okay? It's not just a portrait of a king standing there in his robes staring at you looking tough. It is basically a family showing off what they have. And so we see, here's this guy. He's been in trade and he's been in banking and everything else. He's got, his rich robes on. He's probably wearing silks and velvet, and he's got some meat on his bones. He's not starving. He gets some nice, 3 square meals a day. And then he's showing off his wife here as well. And not just his wife, but he's showing off, what about her that shows that we've made it. We're at the top. We're at the pinnacle of this whole thing. Well, obviously, what she's wearing. Once again, she's not missing any meals. But more importantly, her clothing as well. She's wearing silks and velvets and imported things that he's paid for. Her jewels, her pearls, her hair cover, right? Her hairnet is encased in jewels and it's a fine silk and everything else. Okay, so these are the Visconti family. We have I can't remember who these guys are. Oh yeah. We have the Sforzas, okay? So once again, got the guy in his robes. He's got his falcon, that he's probably using for hunting. Then he's got his wife there, and she's got her little lapdog, okay? Because she's a kept woman. She's taken care of. She's not working. They don't work now at this point, okay? You have the Della Scaglia family, okay? This is a very famous portrait. Absolute perfect embodiment of the Italian great family. She is covered in jewels, her hairstyle, everything else. He's got that perfect Tuscan nose, that Italian nose, that hawk nose. They're sitting there looking at each other and showing off. And in the background, what do you see? You see the representation of their city, and then what's there in prominence? The ships, right? The ships, because the ships have made them money. The ships have made them extremely powerful through their wealth and influence, okay? One of the most famous families, ones that actually put, I believe, now just one. And most Americans have heard of these guys based off of their hit Netflix show. And they are the Borgias, okay? The Borgias, very powerful family in the Renaissance era. Very politically connected, okay? Economy is everything, and making more money and expanding that power is everything. So here we have the grandson of the founder of the Borgia family. His name is Cesare, or Caesar Borgia. Okay, here he is, all looking all handsome and tough. All right, he's the leader of this fancy family. And then finally, the most important one of all, we have the Medici. Okay, whoops, there we go. Okay, and the Medici. Okay, Medicis. There we go. The Medici. The Medici are in Florence. The great grandfather of this guy. So you have this guy's Lorenzo the Magnificent. His father was Cosimo. But the great grandfather of the Medicis, they started out with a bank, but the bank started small. He actually started out as an acorn salesman. He would go to the countryside, he would gather up acorns, he'd bring them back in, he'd sell them, he'd make more money than he started with, and he would do that over and over again till they started selling other things, and they started doing a banking system. And then pretty soon the Medici Bank was the most powerful bank in all of Europe. It had branches, obviously, in Florence. It had branches in Paris, in London, all over the place. Kings themselves were going to the Medici Bank and taking out loans, okay, for wars and everything else. But the Medici are the unrivaled kings of the Renaissance when it comes to the great families, okay? When it comes to great families, the great artisans that we know of, the great Renaissance men, Da Vinci, everything else, these they were being taken care of by these families, especially families like the Medici. Okay, these families formed, and we've heard this word before. They formed oligarchies, right, or controlled by the wealthy and powerful. These people were. This was a free city-state, okay, like Florence, places like that. At the beginning, these were free city-states. People men were allowed to vote, okay, on who they wanted to rule. But since it's an oligarchy, and the entire city their existence is based off this one family, it gets to a point like that where it's a foregone conclusion that, you know, his father was in charge and that he was going to be in charge, and so on, okay? That's who you vote for. Now, at the beginning, these people, remember, they're not nobles, okay? They're not, you know, Count de Medici or something like that. That's not how it was. They were nobodies. They were regular peasantry like everybody else. But we see in those late 1200s up to the 1300s, what are they doing? They're doing what we talked about with the guild system. They're making money. They're making money. And they're using that money to buy influence and buy power, which makes them more money, using that to make more influence and power and so on. That's the whole raison d'etre when it comes to these great families in the Renaissance. More money means more power. More power means more influence. More influence means more money, and so on, okay? It's a continuous cycle. Do what you need to do to gain more power, more money, more influence. And so they form oligarchies. These cities are controlled. They have a council, but these cities are controlled by, you know, this family or that family. Okay, there's other families in these cities, but one usually, you know, is at the top. Okay, and what do? Well, you can either fight with the other family, you know, and pay mercenaries. Remember, there's no standing armies. You can pay mercenaries to fight against that other family, or you can mix with them. You can take, you know, oh, your son just came of age. Well, imagine that. This family we've been fighting with for 100 years, their daughter just came of age, and so now we're going to marry them together. It's a total political marriage, a total business marriage, and their children will have both bloodlines running in them, and we'll try and meld the families together, okay? But we've seen that as, you know, as tropes, as plot devices, like in Shakespeare plays and everything else. And it was so well known that that's what happened, okay? What's really interesting is that, especially places like in Florence, you know, these were still tough cities, okay? You know, there was a civil guard and everything else, and different districts of the cities would fight with each other, you know? One district would be in charge of, you know, whatever, be under the auspices of whatever, the dyers guild or something like that, and the people would fight against each other. They would, you know, these great families eventually turn this into like sporting events where, you know, they would be on one, you know, they would take bets, and a group of these regular people would be on one side of the bridge, and the other group would be on the other side, and they would fight in the middle. And these battles would last all day. You weren't allowed to bring swords and things like that, but you could bring clubs and everything else. And, you know, people got, you know, their heads, you know, knocked in a couple times. And the great families would just sit there in their, you know, the private boats on the river, like the River Arno and things like that. And they would watch and, you know, take bets and stuff like that. So interesting way they dealt with these problems. But eventually these great families started getting so powerful that they started doing something for the first time really in European history, and that was granting themselves titles. They eventually make it to the point in the 1400s where they start granting themselves titles. So you have all of a sudden, you know, this person was just, they give themselves a title of nobility, and they're not just, you know, Mr. Whoever. Now all of a sudden they're the Duke or the, you know, count of whatever. And they basically, there's no one there to tell them no, because there's no king to say no. This isn't part of the ancient custom tradition. Your forefathers haven't owed allegiance to my forefathers. Because remember, these people control what matters now, and that is money. Okay? These people control what matters now, and that is money. But most importantly, with what these great families were doing is this concept here, and that is the concept of patronage. Okay? Patronage. All of these great families, the men, in essence became what is called a patron, P-A-T-R-O-N. And a patron, it had the same terminology now that it does now. A patron is a person who, using their money and influence, brings somebody else in to do something, okay? What that means is, like, if I'm, you know, like now, if I'm some rich millionaire, I will, you know, bring in this guy, some renowned artist, and have him paint a painting of me and my family, or just me, or whatever it might be. There are many reasons why these great families did this in the Renaissance. And the biggest one was something that, you know, the Romans had come up with. And so they just reinstituted the policy. And that was patronage was, one of the reasons for patronage was it was the ability to show the spectacle of power to the people. And we saw this with the Romans, right? So you get like some guy who was running for office, you know, he was running for Senate. And what did he do? Well, he was already part of a rich family. You know, he wasn't just some bumpkin that was running for the Roman Senate. He was already part of a well-established ancient Roman family. But to get in the people's good graces, what would he do? He would take his own money, right? His family's money, and he'd have a new fountain built, right? And he would stick it out there, and he would basically give it to the people. And he would make sure that the person that built the fountain put his name all over it. This fountain generously donated to you by Marcus, you know, Junius, you know, whoever is, okay? And it was a way for him to show his influence and power. Like, I have so much money, and I have so much ability to sway whatever I want and get people to do what I want, that, look, I can just afford to build this, you know, this public fountain for you out of my own money. Didn't cost the taxpayers one bit, didn't cost the public one amount, you know, one, you know, sesterce, nothing like that. It's here for you. And I'm giving it to you. You don't, it's free of charge. You don't have to pay any money for it. The great families did the same exact thing, okay? They would bring in somebody like Da Vinci. They would basically laud him and fet him, bring him in. he would be living literally at one of the palaces of a person like Lorenzo de Medici, living there for however long it took. And Leonardo would say, what do you want? He goes, well, I want two different things from you. Number one, I want something personal for me. I want a symbol every day that I walk past that shows my magnificence, my how amazing I am, how great my family is. So I want you to do a painting for me, okay, whatever it might be, like this. I want you to do an incredible painting of my daughter, or a painting of my wife, or a painting of the palace, or a painting of me, or a sculpture, whatever it might be. I want that there for me, for my own personal taste. I want to see it. And so what was great for these Renaissance men like Da Vinci or Michelangelo is that they weren't paying for any of this stuff. All of this was being paid for by the great family member, okay? By the great families. They were paying for the supplies. They were paying the room and board of that person. They were paying him a stipend. They were paying for any workers, like helpers that he needed. They were paying for transportation. They're paying for everything, okay? So you, as an artistic genius, all you had to do was be an artistic genius. And since that's your calling, that's what you want to do anyway, this is an amazing thing for these people. And they're able to do and try new techniques, right? Because it's the Renaissance, to take those old ideas and come up with new things. And they're able to do all this new stuff, innovative techniques. We're not going to get into all that, but you're able to do that now because, it's not your own money on the line. Somebody else is paying for you to do it. So this is a win-win for everybody involved. The second most important thing about patronage is what we just talked about with the Romans, is that you have that Renaissance man, right, build or create something. Build something to show your authority, okay? Just like the Romans did 1,000 years earlier. You're basically telling Da Vinci or Michelangelo, look, I want you to build this thing, and I want you to, you're going to build my thing, but now you're going to take this thing, you're going to stick it out there in the middle of one of these public places, okay? So people are going to be walking past it all over the place. And I don't want you to make something distasteful, like put something all over the side of it saying Leonardo, or excuse me, Lorenzo the Magnificent had this built, because it would detract from the beauty of it. But everybody's going to understand, and they will know quite quickly who's the person who had this built. They're going to know you. They're going to know you, the artisan who did it, but they're also going to know that I'm the one who started the project. I'm the one who paid for the project. And what does this do? It's something to show your authority, that you're in charge of this city, that nothing happens in this city without your say-so, and that you, in effect, run this city. And then all the people that are there, they may vote for you, they might not vote for you to be the leader of this city-state, but you are darn well going to know that that what they say usually goes, because they're in charge. Okay, so the Renaissance allows this flourishing because of this new money and ideas that are coming in. Something that usually in another place could only be done by like the king or the noble, and the kings are not really prepared to do that at first, right? So if we go to like the King of France, when he's building something, if like the King of France in the year 1450 builds like an amazing garden with like four fountains and whatever, beautiful imported flowers, he's sure as heck not doing it because he's allowing just the regular peasants to go in there and take a look at it. He's not doing it for their benefit. He's doing it for his own benefit. He's spending a ton of taxpayer money to build something for himself and for his friends and for his family. So they can go wander around, because it's not like they're working anyway. They can go wander around and enjoy it and say, wow, and it's a way for him to brag to his friends. Look how amazing I am. I'm the king. Look at what I got built, right? But it's not for the people. The people don't get any participation in it at all. And as you can, understand, this builds up huge amount of resentment that will, blow its top in 300 years. It takes a long time. It's a slow cook recipe. But in the city-states, patronage allows those two things. So number one, you get all these amazing things built for you. But number two, it's a visible way for you to give to the people give back to the people and show the people how amazing you are, and how powerful you are, but also to keep them what? On your side, okay? So that they are realize that you're you're a person, a citizen, just like them, of this city-state. And that's the end of our thing, so we'll stop in just a second. But that you're not just like them, and they understand that, right? But you're not a king, okay? You're not, you know, an emperor or a prince or something like that, okay? And so there you go. We're going to talk a lot more about the humanities next week when we finish up with the course. And there we go. But one other thing that the Renaissance does, folks, this is what we'll finish up with here in the next 1 minute, is the Renaissance is the... So the Renaissance is the final nail against, remember we talked about scholasticism, okay? So the scholasticism, that really hard to understand concept where religious authorities and theologians were trying to use reason and logic to prove faith. And they got away with it for a very long time. But once you get to the Renaissance and you have this whole new explosion of new ideas from the old ideas, scholasticism starts, and even the church acquiesces to this and starts to, you know, gradually get rid of it out of their teachings. That's not how it is. That there is a separation between faith and science, that you can't logically use science or science and reason to prove something that is improvable, right? Unprovable, unprovable. That if you have faith, you have faith. Great. But you feel faith. You feel devotion to God. And it can be taught, but you can't prove it using using science, okay? That these two are now irrefutably separated, but the Renaissance doesn't mean, like I said, not at all, a direct condemning of religion, not at all. They are still together. They're just not, you know, like this anymore. They're still, all through the Renaissance and for many centuries after that, you're still going to have a devout focus on faith and understanding God. But now all of a sudden, you have just this separate thing. The study of reason, the study of logic, the study of rhetoric, the study of philosophy. It's its own thing, okay? And never again will the church try and meld the two, okay? Because it can't work. It's like oil and water. They will never mix. You can dump them together, but they will always be separate from each other, okay? All right, folks, so we are going to wrap up with that. Next week is going to be a much shorter talk, unfortunately. The reason being is because next week you guys would normally, if we were in class, be doing a in-class mini project, kind of a way to get you guys ready to do your, you know, your big project that you're doing, your video turn it in part of your figure of importance thing. But we can't do that, and I don't, you know, want to just come up with something new. Because this was all, you know, it happened, and I don't want to come up with some whole new project to do for you. So next week, there's not going to be an in-class question, because that would have been this little mini project thing. There's no in-class question. There's also not going to be a turn it in question too. That stuff is done, folks, because I want you focused on getting your paper done, and I want you focused on getting that video done as well, okay? Remember, that's done, uploaded to turn in by the 6th. Before midnight. Once it hits midnight, that shuts off and you can't turn in anymore. So you still have what, like a little over a week to get that done. I want you focused on that, and then next week we're going to be doing that last little lecture. It's very short, and then I'll be sending out your study guides, and we're going to be doing the test. The test is all going to be online, obviously, and it will be through the modules. I'm going to put it up there, and I'll show you how it's going to go, because I'm kind of revamping it and everything else because of, you know, our situation now. Okay, folks. Well, I guess I will talk to you next week. So have a good rest of the week or whatever weekend when you watch this, and ciao.